I would very much like to take the opportunity to draw attention to an aspect that has so far been neglected in provenance research, especially the loss of the cultural property suffered by Sinti and Roma as a result of National Socialist persecution. In my lecture, I will concentrate on the conditions in the German Reich, although the European dimension would, of course, also have to be considered in order to obtain a complete picture. But we have not the time to do this. The object you see here was designed by the artist Ulrike Oether after a violin belonging to the musician Markus Reinhardt. It was made for an exhibition I curated in 2020 at the City of Cologne's Documentation Center on National Socialism. The object refers to one of the voids I will address in the course of the lecture, the loss of thousands of musical instruments owned by Sinti and Roma. At the outset, I would like to ask why provenance research has not dealt with this topic so far. First of all, the general lack of interest in coming to terms with this genocide certainly plays a role. This has led to the fact that notable academic studies have only appeared since the mid-1990s. It took another 30 years from the first political recognition of the genocide in 1982 by Chancellor Helmut Schmidt to the dedication of a memorial for this group of victims in Berlin in 2012. In these decades after the end of the Second World War, the former perpetrators largely shaped the image of the victims. They denied racist persecution and, in a perfidious reversal of guilt, blamed the victims themselves for being deported to concentration and extermination camps. The victims were said to have been criminal and asocial. We already heard about that. The strategy of the persecutors worked. Hardly anyone responsible was convicted of the crimes committed against Sinti and Roma after 1945. The reason that this defamation of the victims succeeded is that post-war society largely shared these ideas. The negative attributions were linked to traditional anti-Gypsy distorted images. So-called gypsies have always been marked as foreigners. Poverty, begging, and being on the margins were attributed to them. The Nazi propaganda had once again updated these ideas, which had been known since the Middle Ages, in glaring images. A look into the family albums of German Sinti and Roma shows how little this corresponded to the actual living situation. The photographs we see here come from the collection of the Documentation and Cultural Center of German Sinti and Roma in Heidelberg, and they were collected, of course, by our colleague, Dr. Frank Reuter. Only the civil rights movement was able to counter the racist image of the enemy with a self-image that reflects the diverse realities of life. The photographs are taken from an exhibition available online, which was also created by the Documentation Center and curated by Frank Reuter. And if you browse through the wealth of local and regional studies that are now available for Germany, you will come across many private photographs that show Sinti and Roma did not live any differently from the rest of the population of the Reich. Some were poor, others lived in middle class or upper middle class circumstances. The same was true for the Franzens and the Lagerins we see here, the Bambergers and Höllenreiners, the Lamperts and Roses. They went to school, went to war for the Kaiser, practiced their professions, celebrated weddings and Christmas or the baptism of children. The Nazi regime put an end to this normality. Since the history of the persecution of the Sinti and Roma is not quite well known, I would like to name just a few important stages here. Since 1933, Sinti and Roma have been in the net of the Nazi racial policy. With the Nuremberg laws, they were also considered a so-called alien race. The same year, municipalities began segregating them in forced camps, the so-called gypsy camps. In 1936, Heinrich Himmler issued the first decree on combating the so-called Gypsy Plague. In the same year, the Rassenhygienische and Bevölkerungsbiologische Forschungsstelle in the Reich Health Office began its work to register all of the approximately 20,000 Sinti and Roma in the Reich. In 1938, the racial categorization became the basis for further policy. The Reichszentrale zur Bekämpfung des Zigeunerunwesens functioned as the central persecution authority. Also in 1938, hundreds of Sinti and Roma, mostly young men, were already deported to concentration camps under the label of being a social. We heard about this also. Shortly after the war began, the Reich Security Main Office decided to deport both the Jewish population and all Sinti and Roma. In preparation for the deportations, the so-called Festsetzungserlass was issued, which meant that from one day to the other, people were no longer allowed to leave their current place of residence or where they stayed. In May 1940, the first deportation of about 2,500 Sinti and Roma took place family by family. In December 1942, Heinrich Himmler finally ordered the deportation to Auschwitz-Birkenau, which took place already at the end of February 1943. By the end of the year, thousands had already died in the camp. Only a few were transferred to other concentration camps in 1944 as fit for work. The rest were murdered in gas chambers during the night of 2nd to 3rd August 1944. I return to the question posed at the beginning. Another reason why provenance research has so far not devoted itself to the cultural assets of German Sinti and Roma may be that they were not only defamed as impecunious, but also as cultureless. This classification, which emerged in the context of modern racism, had been popularized above all by Heinrich Moritz Gottlieb Grellmann with his treatise, The Gypsies, published in 1783. He claimed that they were a people who could not undergo a civilizing development like the European cultured man. From this point of view, Sinti and Roma would not be capable of cultural achievements. In fact, since the 15th century, Sinti and Roma have not only participated in European cultural life, but have produced significant cultural creations in their own right. In this context, I would like to draw your attention to Rom Archive. You have mentioned it earlier. The Digital Archive of Arts and Cultures of Sinti and Roma. A look at music history alone shows that Sinti and Roma, for example, in Spain, Russia, or Hungary, have played a major role in the development of national musical styles. The influence of the guitarist Django Reinhardt, who introduced jazz to Europe and developed his own style, and who is, I am sure, known to most of you, is undisputed. When the deportation victims were taken from their homes, police officers inventoried their property. We see here a list of the property of a Cologne Sinto who was deported in May 1940. The list includes 9 violins, a children's violin, and a bass violin. The register already shows one of the difficulties that could hinder restitution. There's no information on the manufacturer or age of these objects, nothing that would make it possible to identify these objects again and assign them to an owner. Such lists were filled out thousands of times, often inadequately and incompletely. The property of the Sinti and Roma deported to occupied Poland in May 1940 and to Auschwitz-Birkenau from spring 1943 was confiscated for the benefit of the Reich. 2 decrees were issued declaring the deportees to be hostile to the folk and the state. Thus, their possessions could be confiscated by the Reich on the basis of the law of 14 July 1933. Here, too, it was the head finance officers that sold the movable property, often at public auctions. This letter from the Berlin Gestapo, sent to the chief finance president of Berlin-Brandenburg on 5th May 1943, illuminates three important aspects. Firstly, it proves the systematic nature of the deportation practice of Jews and Sinti and Roma. The deportation of several hundred Sinti and Roma from Berlin to Auschwitz was part of the deportations from the Reich capital known as waves. We see the handwritten note, Welle 53, in red pencil. On the other hand, it becomes clear that not only the criminal police, but also the Gestapo were involved in the deportations of the Sinti and Roma. And finally, the letter proves the systematic nature of these spoliations. Mention is made of cash, jewelry and housing inventories, flats and caravans confiscated for the benefit of the Reich. An unmeasured loss is the beginning of my lecture title. I will not be able to measure the loss here, but I will give a few examples to illustrate the dimension of the cultural theft that had taken place. The economic activities of German Sinti and Roma were manifold. Self-employment played a major role. By no means all, but many practiced itinerant trades, offering goods and services. An important branch of the profession was the entertainment industry. Circuses with elaborate interiors were among them, fascinatingly beautiful carousels that could be found at fun fairs, but also cinemas. We see here one of these traveling cinemas, that of the Franz family. Such cinemas carried film culture into the villages of the Reich and were very popular with the public. The carriages were, as can be guessed from the photograph, often very elaborately designed and therefore very valuable. Many were custom-made from pitch pine wood and worth several thousand Reichsmarks. Puppet theaters were also very popular. There were several families among the Sinti who had been running puppet theaters for generations. Here we see the Blum and Hähnel families who performed with their puppet theater mainly on Saxon stages. Annette Leo has written a highly recommendable book about the history of these families and their theater. In it, she describes in detail not only the persecution of the families and the murder of many of them, but also the puppet theater and the, in the end, unsuccessful attempts of survivors to get back the puppets' equipment and carriages after 1945. The most important source of income for Sinti and Roma in the cultural sector was probably music. Like Josef Schopper and Georg Braun, whom we see here, they were very well-trained musicians who had often learned several instruments from childhood. They performed with their own ensembles and were a natural part of the cultural scene in the Weimar Republic. They played the common repertoire of the time: salon music, evergreens, dances, hits, and classical music. Georg Braun had completed classical training at the conservatory and was a member of the Berlin Radio Orchestra. Both musicians were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Josef Schopper survived, Georg Braun was murdered there. Under the Nazi regime, Sinti musicians were gradually excluded from cultural life. Bans on performing, the revocation of trade licenses, and exclusion from the professional association Reichsmusikkammer followed. Only a few ensembles, such as the Tanz- und Unterhaltungskapelle Eckstein, shown here, were still able to perform after 1939 because the ensemble members were not yet registered as gypsies. But it was not long before these musicians were also persecuted and deported to concentration camps. Richard Eckstein the Elder on the left was murdered in Sachsenhausen in 1942, and concertmaster Markus Eckstein, second from left, in the Lublin-Lengberg concentration camp in 1944. The musicologist Claudia Maurer-Zenk estimates the number of Sinti and Roma who were persecuted as musicians under the Nazi regime for the area of the German Reich, including Austria, at between 833 and 992 people, according to extrapolations. Since many musicians practiced several professions and quite a few had already been forced out of their profession since 1933, this number is likely to increase as a result of further research. From files at the higher tax offices, it emerged that survivors attempted to obtain compensation for the property looted from them. There is hardly any documentation of restitution, as it seemed almost impossible to determine the whereabouts of the objects. Some Sinti and Roma were not only musicians, but also instrument dealers or instrument makers. Very valuable instruments had been in their possession. For example, the musician and instrument dealer Josef Lehmann made claims for 2 Italian violins and 1 French violin, which was an older master violin. His claim was rejected. Another example is Anton Kreutz. He wrote to the Cologne Chief Finance Office to assert his claims. Quotation: "At that time, I was active as a musician in a band. I played the violin, double bass, and guitar. I often played at the Sandler Brewery near the Old Town Hall in Bonn. With the band I belonged to, I also played in other places. Therefore, I owned a violin which I played myself, as well as at least 10 violins made by my late father, a double bass and a guitar. My father was a violin maker and had left me the violins mentioned above." End of quotation. In the restitution proceedings, Anton Kreutz had to agree to a settlement that was far from the value he had demanded. Of course, he never got his instruments back. The cultural loss caused by the genocide cannot be quantified. Not only were the instruments passed down from generation to generation, stolen from the Sinti families, hundreds of musicians who were the bearers of cultural knowledge were murdered, thus breaking off the transmission to the next generations. Many musicians who survived were physically and mentally broken and no longer able to practice their profession. They also lacked their former partners. It was not uncommon for only 2 or 1 member of an ensemble to have survived. There has not yet been any systematic research on the nature and extent of the theft of cultural property owned by Sinti and Roma. Future research can approach the topic from 2 sides. In the meantime, there's an abundance of biographical texts on many Sinti and Roma families in which cultural activities are reported. A comparison with restitution files, in particular with the records of the then Chief Finance Directorates, would enable representative micro-studies for the Reich. But it will be very difficult to find out into whose possession the cultural assets have passed. As Josephine Ulrich has pointed out, there was a large network of profiteers. Many objects often passed into private hands, often illegally, and without documentation of the process. The extent to which instruments or other culturally significant objects passed into museum collections would have to be examined. A first step towards clarification would be to increase sensitivity for the cultural assets of Sinti and Roma in these contexts. And as we heard today, the Handreichung doesn't mention these cultural assets. At the very end, I would like to draw your attention to a component of the memorial to the Sinti and Roma murdered under National Socialism in Berlin, because it is related to the topic discussed here. It is a violin note that can be heard permanently at the fountain. It contains the story of 2 musicians two brothers of the Franz family. Vinko Paul Franz played the violin. His brother Albert Franz, who was a year younger, played the harp. In 1943, they were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they were murdered. Parents and siblings managed to escape arrest and also managed to take the instruments with them. They survived in hiding. Among other things, the violin bow of Vinko Paul Franz was preserved. With this violin bow, his great-nephew, Romeo Franz, played a piece he composed especially for the memorial. So you can go and listen to it. Thank you for your attention.